Hey, have you ever seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? Or better yet, have you ever read the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey? If you haven't, I highly recommend it. If you have, you're going to really love this podcast. One way or another, you all want to stick around because boy, do I have some stories for you. I am Mr. E with MysterE's Mysteries. We are here to discuss all things mysterious in the world of psychology. So, today's topic, the lobotomy. In the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, there is a character named McMurphy who is a wild man, and he is in jail, and he gets shifted to a mental health facility in the 60s and late 50s, and this would probably now be called, or excuse me, in the past be called an insane asylum, but we would call it a mental health facility. And he was shipped there in this story, in this book, and all sorts of things happened that led to his demise. And today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about what Mr. McMurphy in the movie experienced, in the book experienced, as well as how 50,000 other people in the United States have experienced a lobotomy. So a lobotomy is actually a surgery where there's two different ways that they can go about it. The first way that was created was a way that was created by Antonio Moniz, who actually won the Nobel Prize for this surgery. And what he would do, he was crack open the skull, and in the frontal lobe, and in parts of the frontal lobe, we have these neural networks. If you've seen our podcast before, you'll know a little bit about this, but neural networks are what connects all of our information together. And we have neural networks specifically for emotional processing. And Moniz's theory was that if he broke up some of those overactive, hyperactive neural networks, that would calm people down who had everything from, well, what we would call today antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder. They would call it in the past hysteria. They would also call it a nervous breakdown, oppositional defiance. You name it. He was hoping that this surgery could be just one of those things that could help all of these different problems by severing or snipping, cutting out these neural networks. And like I said, Moniz won a Nobel Prize. It was brought to the United States by a man named Walter Freeman. Walter Freeman didn't want to spend 6, 7, 8 hours in surgery going through this process of cracking open the skull and destroying these neural networks, thus calming down his patients. So he was like, well, what could we do so we wouldn't have to crack open the skull? And this is hard to talk about because it's kind of graphic. He came up with something called the ice pick lobotomy. And we don't have ice picks anymore because we have ice trays. We have ice makers. But way back when, you would have this service that would deliver ice to you, and this ice would be delivered in these big chunks. And you would break it up with these things called ice picks. And they would look like this. They would have a T handle. They would be made out of steel, and they would have a sharp point, just like this pencil. And you would chip away at the ice. So Freeman said, well, how can we access the frontal lobe, this area right here, where some of our emotional center lies? And again, the brain is incredibly complex. We have a lot more emotional centers than that, specifically the limbic system. But in this case, the frontal lobe is where they wanted to go. So what he would do is he would knock the patient out with what is called an insulin therapy. And so they would be unconscious, and he would slide their eye away, and he would go in through the corner of each eye, right here and right here, with the ice pick, missing the eye, going up into the brain, not seeing anything, and he would just twist the ice pick around. I know, it's a little graphic. And that was supposed to calm people down. Between the 1930s and the early to mid 1950s, that's when the majority of lobotomies occurred in the United States. Most of them done by Walter Freeman, although he did teach other people how to do them. And they were done to over 50,000 people, including my uncle. My uncle had a lobotomy in the early 1950s. And I'll kind of walk you through this. It really mirrors what occurred in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So my other uncle is really curious, or was really curious, if there was a connection to those. But what my uncle did is he was a bit wild when he was younger, and he got into some trouble, and he stole a car. It happened to be a cop car, a police car. Oops. And he was placed in jail. And at the time, they were taking many young adults, specifically males, that had impulse control issues, emotional problems. My uncle may also have been a schizophrenic, difficult to diagnose and difficult to differentiate back in the 50s. Much not simpler, but much, the diagnosis is much more available nowadays. And so the doctors, the psychiatrists in the hospital said to my grandmother, hey, we have a new procedure that can fix your son. And you can go into a mental health facility. We can do this surgery and it will cure him from his impulse control issues and his possible schizophrenic brain. And my grandmother was like, this will help him? Yeah, absolutely. And so they did the surgery. And like many of the surgeries, it was an utter failure. And my uncle, for a lack of better terms, ended up in what would be called a vegetative state. The best case scenario with individuals that had a lobotomy is they would pretty much lack any sort of emotion. So they would feel pretty dead to the world. The worst case scenario was death. And my uncle's was probably the second worst, where he was in pretty much a vegetative state. He couldn't feed himself. He needed help going to the bathroom. He needed help doing anything. He lived in a facility for the rest of his life from his early 20s until his death in his mid 60s. And it was because of this lobotomy that Walter Freeman had created using the ice pick. One of the really interesting stories for this is because people get really frustrated when medicines and procedures don't get FDA approved really fast. But this is one of those stories that justifies why our system, why our set of regulations are so important in the medical field, because we don't want these types of things occurring. Luckily, by the 1950s, Walter Freeman was done. He got banned from the East Coast. All of the medical institutions in the East Coast banned him. So he moved out west and he started to do lobotomies on unhappy housewives. Yeah, it was just housewives that were depressed or bored or unhappy. And ultimately what happened is he had a second patient die, and that was it. And he lost his medical license and he was done performing lobotomies. The story doesn't totally end there. Nowadays, lobotomies are used. They are incredibly rare and they're not of the ice pick variety. So we have really incredibly complex imagery machines now that can light up when part of your brain is going berserk. And if you've watched our previous episodes, you know that I had OCD, and lobotomies can now be used for the most extreme cases of OCD. They don't like to use them. They are not going to be covered by insurance. But for people that have extreme OCD, that's not me, but people that have such extreme OCD that they cannot function in society and they have the money and the means to do this, the surgeons will go in. And this type of lobotomy, they find where the brain is lighting up, where those hiccups of obsessions and compulsions are firing, and they'll go in and they'll snip those and they'll try to stop the firing of those obsessive thoughts and those compulsive rituals, because all it is this cycle of firing that occurs over and over again. So it is actually still used today. So I wanted to add, like always, I love to add that little piece of information that is present today. I am Mr. E. This is Mr. E's Mysteries. Make sure that you give us a follow on anywhere that you see podcasts, Spotify, Apple, whatever. Make sure you follow us on all of our YouTube and other social media channels. A big thank you to Bear Wade and Unify Agency. He is the daddy Mac when it comes to directing and producing influencers and podcasters. You know what? Once again, I just had a great time sharing with you a little piece of information. Make sure you leave us a note. Leave us a 5-star, anything that can help give us some cred. All right, you guys have a great day. We'll see you.